The clatter of silver on porcelain fell silent. In the city's most exclusive restaurant, where fortunes were discussed over truffle-infused everything, all eyes turned to one table. There sat Evelyn Ainsworth, the matriarch of an empire, a woman whose stoicism was as legendary as her wealth. But she wasn't looking at her grandson's smirking fiancé or the billion-dollar contract on the table. Her gaze, filled with a raw, soul-shattering grief, was fixed on a young waitress. Not on her face, but on the simple, tarnished silver locket hanging around her neck. And then the unthinkable happened. The iron-willed billionaire broke down, a sob tearing from her chest that echoed a lifetime of loss. The Grand Oak Room of the Celeste restaurant was a sanctuary for the city's elite. Its walls, panelled with wood from ancient forests, absorbed secrets, whispered over champagne and multi-million-dollar deals. Tonight it was the chosen venue for the Ainsworth family to celebrate an engagement, or rather to publicly endorse one. At the head of the table sat Evelyn Ainsworth, a woman of 82, whose sharp sapphire eyes had overseen the rise of a global shipping dynasty. She was a fortress, her emotions locked away since the day tragedy had shattered her world 40 years ago. Across from her, her grandson Richard preened. He was the heir apparent, more interested in the Ainsworth fortune than the family name. His fiancée, Tiffany Dubois, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her ambition, clung to his arm, her diamond ring catching the light of the crystal chandelier. Evelyn's son, Robert, and his wife, Victoria, sat stiffly, their smiles as curated as the floral arrangements. They were watching Evelyn as they always did, gauging her moods, calculating their positions. The service was impeccable, as expected. A young waitress, her auburn hair pulled back in a simple, neat bun, moved with quiet efficiency. Her name was Amelia, and at 22 she was already weary. Life had been a relentless series of tempests, and this job, with its meager pay and demanding clientele, was her rickety lifeboat. She had learned to make herself invisible, a ghost who refilled water glasses and cleared plates without a sound. As Amelia leaned forward to serve Evelyn, her consommé, the delicate chain around her neck, swung free from the collar of her uniform. At the end of it hung a small, unassuming locket. It was not a grand piece of jewelry. It was silver, tarnished with age, with a simple, hand-engraved starburst on its surface. It was Amelia's only possession of any real meaning, the one thing she'd had with her when she was found a toddler, abandoned at the steps of an orphanage. Evelyn, about to dismiss her with a curt nod, froze. Her spoon clattered against the porcelain bowl. Her breath hitched. The carefully constructed dam that had held back 40 years of unspeakable grief began to crack. The starburst. The same imperfect, slightly off-center starburst she had engraved herself with a trembling hand, a gift for her own daughter Eleanor, on her 18th birthday. Where? Evelyn's voice was a choked whisper, a sound no one at the table had ever heard her make. Where did you get that? Amelia straightened up, startled. All eyes were on her. She felt a hot flush of panic. Had she done something wrong? Spilled something? Her hand flew instinctively to the locket. It was mine when they found me. It's all I have from my parents. The world seemed to tilt for Evelyn. The polished mahogany, the gleaming silverware, the faces of her family, it all blurred into an indistinct haze. All she could see was that locket. She saw her daughter Eleanor, her face radiant with youth, laughing as she fastened the chain around her neck. She saw the argument, the terrible final fight that had sent Eleanor storming out into the rainy night, never to be seen again. She saw the decades of silence, of hollow holidays and birthdays that were just another day to mourn. A single tear traced a path down her meticulously powdered cheek, then another. Victoria gasped, a delicate hand flying to her pearls. Robert's face hardened, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Richard and Tiffany exchanged a look of utter confusion and annoyance. Who was this girl, this nobody to disrupt their perfectly orchestrated evening? But Evelyn was lost to them. The fortress had crumbled. A sob, raw and guttural, tore from the depths of her soul. She reached a trembling hand across the table, not towards her family, but towards the waitress. Eleanor. She whispered, the name a ghost on her lips. My child. Amelia stood frozen, a deer in the headlights of a pain so immense it filled the entire room. She had no idea what was happening, why this powerful, imposing woman was looking at her as if she'd seen a ghost, or why she was calling her by a name that wasn't hers. The other diners were now staring openly, their murmurs a rising tide of gossip. The restaurant manager, a portly man named Mr. Dubois, Tiffany's uncle, of course, hurried over his face, a mask of frantic apology. Mrs. Ainsworth, is everything all right? Shall I remove her? He hissed, glaring at Amelia. Evelyn's head snapped up. The grief in her eyes was momentarily replaced by the steely command that had built an empire. You will do no such thing, she commanded, her voice shaking but firm. She locked her gaze on Amelia's wide, frightened eyes. Leave us, all of you. I need to speak with this young woman, alone. The command hung in the air as absolute as a royal decree. Robert was the first to object. Mother, this is absurd, he said, his voice a low, controlled rumble of displeasure. You're making a scene. This girl is a nobody. Let's go home. Home. Evelyn's laugh was brittle, a sound like shattering glass. What home? Robert, a mausoleum filled with ghosts you refuse to acknowledge. She turned her gaze back to Amelia, her expression softening into a plea. Please, 5 minutes. Amelia, caught in the crossfire of a family drama she couldn't comprehend, could only nod mutely. Mr. Dubois, seeing the iron in Evelyn's eyes, quickly shooed the Ainsworths away. Tiffany shot Amelia a look of pure venom before allowing Richard to lead her from the room. Robert and Victoria lingered, their faces tight with disapproval and suspicion, until a single sharp glare from Evelyn sent them retreating. The Grand Oak Room, once buzzing with the low hum of privilege, was now eerily silent. It was just the two of them, the billionaire matriarch and the penniless waitress, an invisible, shimmering thread connecting them across a chasm of wealth and time. Come, child, sit, Evelyn said, gesturing to the chair beside her. Her composure was returning, but her eyes, red-rimmed and vulnerable, betrayed the storm raging within. Hesitantly, Amelia sat perching on the edge of the velvet seat. She felt utterly out of place. Her worn black uniform felt like a costume. Her hands, chapped from dishwater, felt rough and clumsy on the fine linen tablecloth. Let me see it, Evelyn whispered, her hand still outstretched. With trembling fingers, Amelia lifted the locket over her head and placed it in Evelyn's palm. The older woman's skin was as soft as parchment, but her grip was surprisingly strong. She cradled the small piece of silver as if it were the most precious treasure on earth. She ran a thumb over the starburst, her eyes closing as if she were reliving a memory. I made this, Evelyn said, her voice thick with emotion. My hands were never skilled with such delicate work. My husband Arthur, he always teased me about it, but I wanted to give her something that came from my heart, not just from my wallet. She looked up, her blue eyes boring into Amelia's. I gave this to my daughter Eleanor for her 18th birthday, the night she left. Amelia listened, her heart pounding. The orphanage had told her she was a foundling with no name, no history. The locket was her only clue, a silent testament to a life she couldn't remember. There was a fight. Evelyn continued her gaze, distant, fixed on a point 40 years in the past. A terrible one, about a boy, a musician, someone I deemed unsuitable. I said things a mother should never say. Cruel things. I told her if she walked out that door to be with him, she should never come back. I never imagined she would listen. The story tumbled out of her, a torrent of confession held back for 4 decades. Eleanor had left that night, taking nothing but the clothes on her back and the locket around her neck. Evelyn, consumed by pride and rage, had waited for her to return to apologize. But the days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and the months into a silent, agonizing eternity. They had hired private investigators, searched for years, but Eleanor and the musician, a young man named Daniel, had vanished without a trace. The police believed they ran away to start a new life. My husband, Arthur, he died of a broken heart, I'm sure of it. He never forgave me. Evelyn confessed, tears welling in her eyes again. And I have never forgiven myself. Amelia felt a profound, aching sadness for this woman. For the first time, she saw past the jewels and the couture suit to the grieving mother beneath. The starburst. Evelyn said, her voice barely audible. It's not just a design. If you press the third point, the one on the right. Her voice trailed off as she manipulated the locket. There was a tiny click, and the face of the locket sprang open. Amelia had owned it her entire life and had never known it could open. Inside, 2 miniature faded photographs were nestled. On one side was a younger, smiling Evelyn. On the other, a beautiful girl with vibrant red hair and eyes the same shade of sapphire blue as the woman sitting before her. Eleanor. And beneath Eleanor's photo, a minuscule inscription, almost worn away with time, read, "Plus que ma propre vie." More than my own life. Amelia stared at the face in the locket. There was a familiarity to the set of her jaw, the curve of her smile. It was like looking at a ghost of her own reflection. Questions she had never dared to ask began to bubble to the surface. Could it be possible? Could this woman, this stranger, hold the key to the mystery of her entire existence? "My name is Amelia," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I was left at the St. Jude's orphanage 22 years ago. This locket was pinned to my blanket." Evelyn looked from the photo of Eleanor to the face of the young woman before her. The same determined chin. The same sprinkle of faint freckles across the bridge of her nose. And the eyes. They weren't blue like hers or Eleanor's, but a warm hazel. The color of Daniel's eyes, the musician she had so cruelly dismissed all those years ago. The hope that bloomed in Evelyn's chest was so fierce it was painful. Could this be, after 40 years of mourning, could this be a miracle? Her granddaughter. The drive to the Ainsworth estate was a silent, surreal journey. Amelia sat in the back of the Rolls-Royce, the plush leather feeling alien against her simple work slacks. She stared out at the city lights, blurring past her mind, a whirlwind of confusion and fragile, nascent hope. Evelyn sat beside her, clutching Amelia's hand, her gaze never leaving the young woman's face, as if she were afraid Amelia might vanish into thin air. The Ainsworth mansion was less a home and more a monument to dynastic wealth. Marble columns soared towards frescoed ceilings, and ancestral portraits with cold, judging eyes lined the grand hallways. Robert and Victoria were waiting in the cavernous drawing room, their postures rigid with hostility. "Mother, this has gone far enough," Robert began, dispensing with any pretense of concern. "You bring a complete stranger, a waitress into our home, based on a piece of cheap jewelry, and a moment of emotional weakness." Victoria glided to her husband's side, her expression a perfect blend of pity and contempt. "Darling, we understand you're upset," she cooed, directing her words at Evelyn, but her sharp glare at Amelia. "But you are vulnerable. This girl is clearly an opportunist. It's a classic con." Amelia flinched as if struck. She had done nothing but her job, and now she was being accused of being a criminal. She had never asked for any of this. "Enough." Evelyn's voice cracked like a whip. "This is not about opportunity. This is about truth. This locket was Eleanor's. I know it as surely as I know my own name. A locket that could have been stolen, sold, found in a gutter." Robert shot back, his face reddening. "Do you have any idea how insane you sound? You're jeopardizing this family's reputation, our legacy, for a fantasy." The true fear behind his anger was clear: his inheritance. For decades, he had been the sole heir to the main Ainsworth line. The sudden appearance of a potential granddaughter, a direct descendant of the lost firstborn, was a threat of catastrophic proportions to him and his own son, Richard. "We will find out the truth," Evelyn stated, her resolve hardening. "I will have my lawyers contact a private genealogical firm first thing in the morning. We will conduct a DNA test." The mention of a DNA test sent a palpable shock wave through the room. It made the impossible suddenly terrifyingly real. Victoria's mask of feigned sympathy slipped, revealing a flicker of pure panic. "A DNA test, Mother, that is a gross invasion of our privacy, and a completely unnecessary step," Robert argued, his voice rising. "We will not have this person's history entangled with ours." "She is not a person, Robert. She may be your niece," Evelyn retorted coldly. "And it is my history, my daughter, my decision. You will respect it." She then turned to Amelia, her expression softening. "You will stay here tonight, in the East Wing." It was Eleanor's. Amelia wanted to refuse to run from this opulent prison and the vipers circling within it. But looking into Evelyn's eyes, she saw a desperate, pleading hope that she couldn't bring herself to extinguish. She was as invested in the truth as Evelyn was. For the first time in her life, she had a chance to know who she was, where she came from. "Okay," she whispered. As the housekeeper, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Davies, led Amelia up the sweeping marble staircase, she could feel Robert and Victoria's hateful glares burning into her back. The storm had not yet broken, but the air was thick with the promise of lightning. Eleanor's rooms were like a time capsule from 40 years ago. Dust covers draped the furniture, but underneath everything was preserved. A collection of vinyl records, including several by a folk artist named Daniel Rivers, sat beside a turntable. A half-finished novel lay on the bedside table. On the vanity, a silver-backed brush still held a few strands of fiery red hair. It was haunting. Amelia felt like an intruder in a sacred space. Exhausted, she sank onto the edge of the large canopy bed. Her mind raced. The locket, the story, the uncanny resemblance in the photograph. Could it truly be her mother? And the musician, Daniel, her father. What had happened to them? Why was she abandoned? The questions were a relentless, pounding headache. Meanwhile, downstairs in his study, Robert was on the phone. His voice was low and venomous. "I don't care what it takes," he snarled into the receiver. "I want you to dig up everything you can on a girl named Amelia. She works at Celeste. I want every shred of dirt, every mistake, every dark corner of her life. I want to prove she is a fraud, and I want to destroy her before she gets a single penny of what is rightfully ours. Spare no expense." He hung up the phone and poured himself a large scotch. Victoria entered the room, closing the heavy oak doors behind her. "Is it done?" she asked. "Larson is on it." Robert confirmed, downing the amber liquid in one go. "He's the best investigator money can buy. He'll find something. Nobody is that clean. By the time he's finished, Mother will be begging us to throw her back on the street where she belongs." Victoria smiled, a thin, predatory curve of her lips. "Good, because if that DNA test comes back positive, our entire world comes crashing down." The battle lines had been drawn. It wasn't just about truth anymore. It was about the survival of their claim to the Ainsworth Empire, and they would stop at nothing to protect it. Amelia barely slept. The luxurious bed felt like a bed of thorns, and the silent, ghost-filled room seemed to press in on her. Before dawn, she rose and wandered through the quiet mansion, eventually finding her way to the vast, conservatory-like kitchen. She made herself a simple cup of tea, the familiar ritual, a small comfort in this strange new world. Evelyn found her there, sitting at a small table, watching the sun rise over the manicured gardens. The matriarch looked tired, the events of the previous night having taken their toll, but her eyes were clear and determined. "I couldn't sleep either," Evelyn said, softly joining her. "Too many ghosts." They sat in a comfortable silence for a few moments before Evelyn asked, "Tell me about you, Amelia. Tell me everything." And so Amelia began to speak. It was a story devoid of privilege, a stark contrast to the gilded life that surrounded them. She spoke of the St. Jude's Orphanage, a clean but cheerless institution run by overworked nuns. She described a childhood of hand-me-down clothes and a constant gnawing feeling of being rootless. She had no baby pictures, no birthday stories, no family anecdotes to share. Her past was a blank page that began on the day she was found on their doorstep. "The locket was my only comfort," she explained, her fingers tracing its outline through her uniform shirt. "When other kids would cry for their mothers, I would hold on to it. I imagined the woman who put it around my neck. I told myself she loved me, and that something terrible must have happened to keep her from me. Tamortas utentortas." She spoke of aging out of the system at 18, with a small state-provided stipend and a world of uncertainty before her. She'd worked a string of grueling jobs, cleaning hotel rooms, stocking shelves overnight, and now waiting tables at Celeste. She'd enrolled in community college, taking night classes in botany, dreaming of one day working in a greenhouse or a public garden, a place where things could grow, where roots were celebrated. "It's been hard," she admitted, her voice steady, without a hint of self-pity. "I've had to move a lot. A few months ago, I was evicted from my apartment because the building was sold. I lost my security deposit. For a while, I was sleeping in my car." Evelyn listened, her heart aching with a mixture of guilt and sorrow. While she had been living in this palace mourning a ghost, her own flesh and blood had been struggling just to survive in the same city. The injustice of it was a physical pain. What would Eleanor think of her for allowing her child to suffer so? "Why didn't you sell the locket?" Evelyn asked gently. "Surely it would have helped." Amelia looked up, and for the first time, Evelyn saw the unshakable core of strength within her. "Sell it never. It was the only proof I had that I came from somewhere, that I wasn't just a mistake. It was worth more than money. It was my identity." The simple, profound dignity of her words struck Evelyn to the core. This was not the statement of a conniving gold digger. This was the voice of a survivor, a young woman who had clung to a single symbol of love through a lifetime of hardship. This was Eleanor's daughter. She felt it in her bones. Later that morning, the family lawyers arrived. Amelia agreed to the DNA test without hesitation, submitting a cheek swab with a quiet grace that further infuriated Robert and Victoria, who watched the proceedings with hawk-like intensity. The results would take 48 hours, 2 days that felt like a lifetime. To keep her mind occupied, Evelyn asked Amelia to walk with her through the estate's famous gardens. It was here among the blooming roses and ancient weeping willows that Evelyn felt most at peace. As they walked, Amelia's passion for botany came alive. She identified plants by their Latin names, pointed out signs of blight on a prize-winning rose bush that the highly paid gardeners had missed, and explained how companion planting could create a more resilient ecosystem. Evelyn watched her captivated. She saw not just her granddaughter, but a bright, intelligent, and deeply kind young woman. She saw the legacy not of her wealth, but of her family's spirit. The hope in her heart burned brighter than ever. But a shadow was lengthening, creeping from the city and towards the idyllic sanctuary of the Ainsworth estate. Robert's private investigator, a ruthless man named Larson, was hard at work, and in the dark, forgotten corners of a life lived on the margins, there are always secrets to be found. Larson, a specialist in twisting perception, was about to find exactly what he was looking for. The 48 hours stretched into an eternity of tense meals and suffocating silences. Amelia spent most of her time in Eleanor's rooms or in the garden, trying to stay out of the way of Robert and Victoria, whose hostility was a palpable force in the mansion. Evelyn, meanwhile, grew more and more certain. She and Amelia would talk for hours, not just about the past, but about the future. For the first time in 40 years, Evelyn was making plans. On the morning the DNA results were due, a heavy tension settled over the house. The family gathered in the drawing room. Evelyn and Amelia sat together on a damask sofa, a united front. Robert paced back and forth in front of the fireplace, while Victoria perched on a chair, radiating icy calm. Just as the lawyer was scheduled to call, Robert's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across his face. "Well, well," he said, silencing the room. "It seems my own inquiries have borne fruit. Before we get the official word, Mother, there is something you need to see." He connected his phone to the large television screen mounted discreetly behind a painting. A file opened, and a series of documents and photographs filled the screen. The heading was stark: Investigative Report, Amelia Scott. "I took the liberty of having a background check run on our guest," Robert announced, his voice dripping with condescension. "I felt it was my duty to protect you, Mother, to protect this family." The first document was a grainy security photo. It showed Amelia looking younger and more desperate, standing outside a pawn shop. The date stamp was from 3 years prior. "Here she is," Robert narrated, "at a shop known for dealing in stolen goods. A frequent visitor, apparently." Amelia gasped. "That's not true. I went there once to sell an old textbook when I couldn't afford to eat." "Of course you did," Victoria murmured, with a dismissive wave of her hand. The next image was a mug shot. Amelia's face, pale and tear-streaked, stared out from the screen. She was 19. "And this arrested for trespassing. Spent a night in jail," Robert said, his voice ringing with accusation. "It was a misunderstanding," Amelia cried, her face flushing with shame. "I was sleeping in my car in a parking lot, and the owner had me arrested. The charges were dropped." But Robert wasn't finished. He brought up bank records showing small, sporadic cash deposits. "And where did this money come from? Amelia always cash. No traceable source. It's a classic pattern." Finally, he displayed the last, most damning piece of information. It was a social media profile of a man in his late 20s, with a sneer and a string of minor convictions. His name was Leo. In one of his photos, he had his arm slung around Amelia. "And here we have Leo the Viper. Vance." Robert declared, his voice booming. "A known con artist, specialized in inheritance scams. Look familiar. Amelia. My investigator found that you were living with him just 6 months ago. He seems to have a particular interest in wealthy, grieving old women. Did he put you up to this? Was he the one who told you about our family tragedy? Did he give you a replica of the locket?" Every piece of evidence, stripped of its context, painted a horrifying picture. A desperate young woman with a criminal associate, a history of suspicious behavior, and a sudden inexplicable appearance in their lives. It was a carefully crafted narrative of deception. Amelia was reeling, struggling to breathe. The pawn shop, the arrest, the cash from waiting tables. Leo, it was all true, but twisted into something ugly and unrecognizable. Leo had been a mistake, a charismatic predator she had briefly fallen for, before seeing his true nature and running. He had been the one to get her evicted. He was a nightmare from her past. She had desperately tried to forget. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "It's not what it looks like. He's lying." Evelyn stared at the screen, her face pale. A flicker of doubt, cold and poisonous, entered her heart. Could Robert be right? Had her grief made her a fool? Had she projected all her hopes and dreams onto a clever charlatan? She looked from the damning evidence on the screen to the desperate, pleading face of the girl beside her. Just then, the landline on the nearby table rang its shrill sound, cutting through the thick, accusatory silence. It was the lawyer. With the DNA results. Robert smirked, crossing his arms. "Go on, Mother. Answer it. Let's hear the truth." All eyes turned to Evelyn. Her hand trembled as she reached for the receiver, her newfound hope hanging by the thinnest of threads. The web of deceit had been spun, and she was caught squarely in the center. Evelyn lifted the heavy receiver, her knuckles white. The voice of her long-time attorney, Mr. Abernathy, was calm and professional on the other end of the line. "Evelyn, I have the results from the lab." The room was so quiet, Amelia could hear the frantic beating of her own heart. Robert's smug expression was unyielding. He believed he had already won. "Go on, Charles," Evelyn said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's a conclusive match." Evelyn roar. Abernathy stated, a hint of awe in his tone. "The mitochondrial DNA passed down through the maternal line is a 99.9999% match. There is no doubt. Amelia Scott is the daughter of Eleanor Ainsworth. She is your granddaughter." The receiver slipped from Evelyn's fingers, clattering onto its cradle. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. She turned to Amelia, her eyes wide, with a torrent of emotions, relief, joy, and a profound, gut-wrenching shame for her moment of doubt. Tears streamed down her face as she pulled Amelia into a fierce embrace. "My granddaughter," she sobbed. "I knew it. I knew it in my soul." Amelia clung to her tears of vindication, and overwhelming emotion blurring her vision. She was not a fraud. She was not a nobody. She was an Ainsworth. She had a family, a grandmother. Robert stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. "No," he stammered. "No, it's impossible. The test is wrong. It's a mistake. The test is science." "Robert, not speculation," Evelyn said, her voice regaining its strength, now laced with cold fury. She turned to face her son, her eyes blazing. "You tried to destroy this girl. You twisted her life, her struggles into a weapon to protect your own greed. Her poverty was not a character flaw. It was a tragedy that happened on our watch." Victoria rushed to her husband's side. "But the evidence, the con artist, Leo. Yes, let's talk about Leo," Amelia said, finding her voice. Her fear was being replaced by a righteous anger. She stepped away from Evelyn's embrace and faced her accusers. "Leo Vance is a predator. I met him when I was at my lowest. He offered me a place to stay, and I was naive enough to believe he was kind. I left the moment I realized what he was. He was the one who scammed me. He's part of the reason I ended up sleeping in my car. She looked directly at Robert. You didn't uncover a conspiracy. You uncovered my pain and tried to use it as a weapon against me. Evelyn's gaze was glacial. And I have a feeling there is more to this story. Your investigator, Robert, a man named Larson. I presume he has a reputation for not just finding facts, but for creating them. She strode to her desk and picked up the phone, dialing a number from the memory. Get me Daniel Croft at the security firm, she commanded. I want a full investigation into this investigator Larson. And while you're at it, run a complete financial audit on my son, Robert Ainsworth, and his wife. I want to see every transaction for the past 5 years. Robert's face went from disbelief to sheer terror. Mother, you can't be serious. This is an outrage. The outrage, Evelyn snapped back, is what you have done. The outrage is that my granddaughter has been suffering while you have been living in the lap of luxury, terrified of losing a fraction of it. You are no longer the executor of my estate, Robert. As of this moment, you are on notice. The power shift was seismic. Robert and Victoria looked at each other, their shared panic a silent scream. Their carefully constructed world, built on entitlement and expectation, was fracturing beneath their feet. They had overplayed their hand, and in their attempt to discredit Amelia, they had inadvertently exposed the rotten core of their own characters to the one person who held their future in her hands. The truth of Amelia's identity was out, but the lies that had been told still hung in the air like poison. Evelyn knew this was far from over. Robert would not give up his birthright so easily. The battle for the Ainsworth legacy had just begun, and its secrets were darker and more complex than anyone could possibly imagine. Evelyn Ainsworth's wrath, once unleashed, was a formidable force. Daniel Croft, her head of security and a former intelligence officer, was ruthlessly efficient. Within 24 hours, the preliminary report on Robert's investigator Larson landed on Evelyn's desk. It was worse than she had imagined. Larson had not only dug up Amelia's past, he had embellished it. The pawn shop owner had been paid to imply Amelia was a regular. The arresting officer from the trespassing incident had been bribed to share the embarrassing mugshot, conveniently omitting the detail that all charges were immediately dropped. Most damning of all, Larson had contacted Leo Vance. There was a record of a $50,000 wire transfer from a shell corporation controlled by Robert to Leo, made the day after Amelia had been brought to the mansion. It wasn't an investigation. It was a setup. Robert had paid Leo to validate his narrative, to be the star witness in his smear campaign. The financial audit on Robert was just as revealing. It showed a pattern of reckless spending, bad investments, and enormous debt, all carefully hidden from his mother. Robert and Victoria weren't just protecting their future inheritance, they were desperate. They needed the Ainsworth fortune to bail them out of a financial hole of their own making. Evelyn called a meeting in the study. She had Croft present his findings dispassionately, laying out the evidence of bribery conspiracy and financial ruin. Robert and Victoria sat in stony silence, their faces ashen. The web of their deceit was laid bare, every sticky thread exposed to the light. When Croft was finished, Evelyn turned to her son. You paid a criminal to defame my granddaughter. You tried to manipulate me and ruin an innocent girl's life, not out of concern for the family, but to cover your own failures. Explain yourself. Robert, stripped of his arrogance, finally broke. She came out of nowhere. He raged, his voice cracking with desperation. For 40 years it was understood that I, and then Richard, would be the heirs. We built our lives on that promise. Then this ghost appears, and suddenly everything is threatened. What was I supposed to do? Just step aside. You were supposed to be a decent human being, Evelyn thundered, rising from her chair. You were supposed to welcome your own blood, the daughter of the sister you claimed to have mourned. In the midst of the shouting, Amelia spoke, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the anger. I have a question, she said, looking not at Robert, but at Evelyn. What really happened to my parents? Your first investigators said they vanished, but people don't just vanish. Her question shifted the focus from the present treachery to the original 40-year-old wound. Evelyn sank back into a chair, the fight draining out of her. We don't know, she whispered sadly. They were gone. That was when Daniel Croft cleared his throat. Mrs. Ainsworth, in the course of my investigation into Larson, I had my team reopen the original cold case file on Eleanor Ainsworth and Daniel Rivers. With modern technology, we can cross-reference data in ways that were impossible back then. He placed another thinner file on the desk. Eleanor and Daniel didn't just run away. They were running from something. Daniel Rivers was not just a poor musician. His father was a key witness in a federal case against the Moretti crime family. He testified, and his family was placed in witness protection. The room fell silent. We believe, Croft continued gravely, that Daniel broke protocol to be with Eleanor. The Morettis found him. 2 days after Eleanor left this house, there was a single-car accident on a rural road upstate. A vehicle registered to an alias of Daniel Rivers went over a cliff and burned. 2 bodies were recovered, burned beyond recognition. At the time, with no dental records to match and no one looking for them, they were buried as John and Jane Doe. He paused, letting the horrific weight of his words sink in. We believe those bodies were Eleanor and Daniel. They were murdered. The air was sucked from the room. Evelyn let out a choked cry, covering her mouth with a trembling hand. 40 years of uncertainty was replaced by a brutal, horrifying truth. Her daughter hadn't abandoned her. She had been killed. Amelia felt her legs give way, and she sank into a nearby chair. Her parents, murdered. The story she had told herself, her whole life, that they were out there somewhere, that they would one day come for her, was a fantasy. Croft continued softly. Our theory is that they knew they were being followed. They must have realized they couldn't protect a child on the run. Leaving you at the orphanage wasn't an act of abandonment, Amelia. It was an act of desperation, an act of love. It was the only way they could save your life. He slid a final piece of paper across the desk. It was a copy of a police report from the night Amelia was found. Pinned to her blanket, along with the locket, was a small handwritten note that had been filed away and forgotten. In elegant looping cursive, it read, Her name is Amelia. Please protect her. We love her more than life. It was signed E. and Dow. The note was the final heartbreaking piece of the puzzle. It was a message from beyond the grave, a final testament to her parents' love. Amelia read the words through a blur of tears, her grief for the parents she never knew, mingling with a profound sense of peace. She had not been thrown away. She had been saved. The revelations hung in the air, a pall of grief and truth that changed everything. The raw 40-year-old wound of Eleanor's disappearance had been cauterized by a horrific certainty. For Evelyn, the guilt was immense. Her pride, her anger had pushed her daughter out of the safety of their home and into the path of monsters. If she had just accepted Daniel, if she had welcomed them, they might still be alive. It was a burden of regret she would carry for the rest of her days. For Robert, the news of his sister's murder was a distant shock, overshadowed by the complete implosion of his own life. Stripped of his authority, his financial ruin exposed, and his conspiracy laid bare, he was a broken man. There was no outrage left in him, only the hollow shell of his entitlement. Victoria, ever the pragmatist, was already mentally calculating the terms of a divorce. Evelyn, with Amelia by her side, acted with swift and decisive purpose. Robert and his family were cut off, not out of spite, but as a consequence. They were given a trust enough to live comfortably, but not lavishly, ensuring they would never again have the power to cause such harm. Richard's engagement to Tiffany Dubois was unceremoniously called off by her family the moment the news of the Ainsworth family's restructuring hit the society pages. The mansion, once a place of tense silences and resentful whispers, began to change. The dust covers were removed from Eleanor's rooms, not to erase her memory, but to honor it. Amelia, with Evelyn's blessing, began to transform the estate. She started with the gardens. She ripped out the overly manicured, sterile flower beds and began cultivating a garden that was wilder, more vibrant, and full of life. It was a physical manifestation of the healing that was taking place within the family's heart. Together, Evelyn and Amelia traveled to the small, forgotten cemetery upstate, where John and Jane Doe had been laid to rest. They had the bodies exhumed, and DNA testing confirmed what they already knew. Eleanor and Daniel were finally given a proper burial in the Ainsworth family plot, their names engraved on a shared headstone beneath the words, "Together forever." For the first time, Evelyn could mourn her daughter not as a lost girl, but as a woman who had loved and been loved, a woman who had died protecting her child. The discovery also led to a reopening of the murder investigation. With the resources of the Ainsworth family behind it, federal agents began to unravel the cold case, breathing new life into the hunt for the Moretti hitmen responsible. Justice, it seemed, was finally on the horizon. Amelia, no longer just a waitress, but the heiress to the Ainsworth legacy, embraced her new role with a quiet strength and humility that surprised everyone. She didn't indulge in the trappings of wealth. Instead, she enrolled in the city's top university to get her degree in botany and environmental science. She began working with Evelyn to establish the Eleanor and Daniel Rivers Foundation, a massive charitable organization dedicated to supporting victims of violent crime and funding arts education for underprivileged youth, a tribute to both her mother and the musician father she never knew. She brought a warmth and life back into Evelyn's world that the old woman thought was lost forever. They were not just grandmother and granddaughter. They were survivors, two women, bound by a shared love for Eleanor, finding solace and purpose in each other's company. One sunny afternoon, months later, Evelyn sat on a bench watching Amelia work in the now thriving garden. Amelia's hands were covered in dirt, a smudge of soil on her cheek, and she was laughing, her face radiant with a joy that seemed to emanate from her very soul. She looked up and caught Evelyn's eye, and in that moment Evelyn saw it all. She saw the strength of her husband Arthur. She saw the fiery spirit of her daughter Eleanor. She saw the gentle soul of a musician named Daniel. And she saw the beautiful, resilient spirit of Amelia, a legacy not of wealth or power, but of love's enduring ability to survive, to take root in the darkest of places, and to against all odds bloom. The Ainsworth fortune was secure, but for the first time, Evelyn understood that the family's true treasure was standing right there in the garden, with dirt on her hands and the sun in her hair. 2 years passed. The Ainsworth mansion, once a cold monument to grief, was now filled with light and purpose. The story of the long-lost heiress had faded from the society pages, replaced by news of the remarkable work being done by the Eleanor and Daniel Rivers Foundation. Under Amelia's guidance and Evelyn's formidable wisdom, it had become one of the nation's most impactful charities. Tonight was the Foundation's inaugural gala, held in a grand ballroom overlooking the city. Amelia stood at the podium, no longer the timid waitress who hid in the shadows, but a poised and eloquent young woman. She wore a simple, elegant navy gown, and around her neck, polished and gleaming, was the starburst locket. She spoke not of loss, but of hope. Not of the darkness her parents had faced, but of the light their legacy was now creating for others. Evelyn watched from the head table, her heart swelling with a pride so immense it brought tears to her eyes. At 84, she had found a new reason to live. She had watched her granddaughter blossom, embodying all the best qualities of the daughter she had lost. As the applause for Amelia's speech subsided, Daniel Croft approached their table, his expression serious but calm. "Mrs. Ainsworth, Amelia," he said in a low voice. "I apologize for the interruption, but I have news." They both tensed. "What is it, Daniel?" Evelyn asked. "The FBI made an arrest this evening in Miami," he said, his eyes meeting Amelia's. "Antonio Moretti, the man who ordered the hit on your parents. He's 89 years old and in failing health, but he will stand trial. They also apprehended the triggerman, a man named Russo in Chicago. After 42 years, they're finally going to answer for what they did." The news didn't land with a triumphant crash, but with a quiet, profound finality. The last ghost had been brought out of the shadows. Amelia reached across the table and took her grandmother's hand. The fight was over. The cycle of violence and fear that had stolen her parents and defined her own lonely childhood had finally come to an end. There were tears in Evelyn's eyes, but for the first time, they were not tears of guilt or sorrow, but of a deep, soul-settling peace. Justice, however, delayed had arrived. Later that week, a letter arrived at the mansion. It was addressed to Amelia. The handwriting was shaky, unfamiliar. It was from Robert. He wasn't asking for money or reinstatement into the family. He was writing from a small, modest home in the countryside where he was now living. He wrote of his shame of the long nights spent contemplating the man he had become. He wrote that hearing the final truth of his sister's murder had shattered the last of his pride. "I was so afraid of losing a fortune that I never realized I had already lost something far more valuable, my own humanity," he wrote. "I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't deserve it. I only hope that one day you can think of me not with hatred, but with pity. I am truly sorry, Amelia." Amelia read the letter to Evelyn in the garden. When she was finished, a long silence settled between them, broken only by the chirping of crickets. "It seems," Evelyn said softly, "that even the most stubborn roots can find a way to grow towards the light." That night, Amelia found her grandmother sitting on a bench overlooking the gardens, staring up at the star-filled sky. She sat beside her, and for a while they watched the cosmos in comfortable silence. "You know," Evelyn said, her voice a soft murmur in the darkness, "I used to hate the night. It reminded me of that last awful argument with your mother, of her walking out into the darkness." She turned her hand, finding Amelia's. Her skin was thin, but her grip was firm. "Now I look up at the stars and I think of that locket, that silly, imperfect starburst I carved myself. I think of how it kept you safe, how it guided you back to me." She looked at Amelia, her eyes even in the dim light shining with an unconditional love that had survived a lifetime of pain. "You are the family's true legacy, Amelia. Not the ships, not the money. Kindness, resilience, hope. That is the Ainsworth legacy now. You remade it. Amelia leaned her head on her grandmother's shoulder, the silver locket cool against her skin. She finally understood. Her life wasn't a story that began with abandonment. It was a story that began with a mother's fierce love, a father's sacrifice, and a starburst, a tiny symbol of hope that had shone in the darkness, until at long last it had guided her home. What a journey of heartbreak, deception, and ultimate redemption. The story of Evelyn and Amelia reminds us that family is not about wealth or status, but about an unbreakable bond that can withstand time, tragedy, and even death itself. A simple locket, a symbol of a mother's love, became the key that unlocked 40 years of secrets, exposing the poison of greed and revealing the beautiful, heartbreaking truth of a parent's final sacrifice. Amelia, who started with nothing, found that she had the greatest inheritance of all, a history, a purpose, and the unwavering love of a grandmother who crossed an ocean of grief to find her. If this story of resilience and love touched your heart, please let us know in the comments below. What part of their story moved you the most? Don't forget to hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a powerful story, and subscribe to our channel for more content that will leave you breathless. Thank you for watching.